Good morning. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is Sunday, May the 4th, 2025, and the world continues to be awash in controversy. But I read a particularly interesting article in the New York Times this week about the possibility of, are you ready for this? A U.S. citizen, just the mere possibility of a U.S. citizen becoming the next pope. And I thought, oh my God, given that everything about U.S. citizens has to do with taxes, reporting, and penalties, I thought I better find out more. And as part of this process, I welcome today the world's renowned FBARologist and world's favorite U.S. tax lawyer, Virginia La Torre Jeker, in Dubai to discuss this important question. So, Virginia, how are you today?
Hi, John. I'm wonderful. And how are you?
Well, all things are good. I'm not in line to be the next pope, so I don't have these kinds of problems. But this is really interesting. I mean, there are all these comments on the article talking about sort of the pros and cons of having a U.S. citizen pope. One of the comments even denied that he was a U.S. citizen, even though he's born in the United States. But in any case, I got to thinking about this, and this strikes me as planting the seeds for a huge, huge regulatory problem. Would you agree with that, Virginia, or have I been thinking about things like FBARs and reporting too long?
I think it's a really interesting idea, John, that if we had a U.S. Pope, what might be, his duties under the Bank Secrecy Act, for example? I mean, you know, we've had we've had some issues in the past regarding the Vatican finances. So, maybe this would open up a whole can of worms with regard to more disclosure. I think it's a fascinating inquiry.
Well, I think it certainly is. And, I think we start from the principle that would this be accurate? If U.S. citizen, then subject to FBAR rules?
Well, I think we have to break it down pretty carefully. So, if we had a U.S. citizen becoming the Pope, what kind of authority does the Pope have over, for example, financial accounts that are belonging to the Vatican, to the Holy See, which is the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Catholic Church, which is, by the way, distinct from Vatican City State. So the Holy See, as you might know, has in fact signed an IGA with the U.S. under FATCA. It's a Model 1 IGA. So I think that's pretty interesting. And, what does that mean about financial accounts in Vatican institutions? The the one in particular that I'm thinking about is the account for the Institute for Works of Religion, or the IOR. That's commonly known as the Vatican Bank. So, what happens there? The Vatican Bank, is it, under the IGA required to identify the accounts held by U.S. taxpayers or U.S. entities with significant U.S. owners? What's the deal? Is the Pope one of those people that would be treated as if he was a U.S. citizen? If the Pope was a U.S. citizen, would he be treated as one of these taxpayers the Vatican Bank might have to report on? Would the Pope be required to file an FBAR? I think we have a lot of questions here.
Well, in fact, that, there's so many questions and so many issues. It almost sounds like sooner or later, the answer to one of those questions is going to be, that the Pope has to report on this stuff, right? But so all right. So we start off with, the problem arises, of course. The seminal problem would be a Pope being a U.S. citizen. I mean, if the Pope were not a U.S. citizen, then we wouldn't have this whole FBAR thing, right?
Correct.
Do you think it might be wise? I mean, theoretically, if a U.S. citizen were appointed, we're going to be the next pope. Would that be a case for renunciation before, to make all the problems go away? Do you think?
Ah, certainly, certainly worth looking into. It would make the problems go away for sure.
I mean, can you imagine going into the consulate and saying, "Well, I have to renounce so I can be the pope"?
Well, we're doing this a little bit tongue in cheek, but the issues are quite significant, and I think would help people understand a little bit more about FBAR overall.
Well, so I mean, clearly,
So let's
go ahead. Take us
so
through.
under the IGA. So let's just think about a couple of things. We will get into the FBAR inquiry, but I would like to know a little bit more about the Vatican Bank signing an IGA. What does that mean? And where does it lead us, for example, if the Pope is a U.S. citizen? So under the IGA, the Vatican Bank is required to identify accounts that are held by U.S. taxpayers or U.S. entities that have significant U.S. ownership. And it has to report the details like account numbers, balances, etc. Just the way, it doesn't matter that it's the Vatican Bank, it's treated the same as other financial institutions that have signed this Model 1 IGA. By the way, the Vatican committed to financial transparency, especially under Pope Francis, because he pushed for reforms to address some past scandals involving the Vatican Bank. Like there were allegations of money laundering and corruption. So I think that signing the IGA was another push toward this financial transparency. So we've got the IGA signed, and that means the Vatican Bank has to comply. So now, what is the Pope's role vis-a-vis the Vatican Bank? What is his role there? Does he have signature authority over Vatican Bank accounts? Does he have, a financial relationship with these accounts? So I think it will be helpful if we just remind our listeners who has to file an FBAR, and then we'll get into what the hypothetical possibilities for the Pope. So who has to file an FBAR is a U.S. person, be them a citizen or a resident or a U.S. entity. They need to file that FBAR if they have a financial interest in or signature authority over financial accounts, which in total aggregate value exceed $10,000 at any time in the calendar year. So financial interest can arise by direct ownership, like you're the owner of record, you hold legal title, or if the account is held for your benefit and you're a U.S. person. And there's other indirect ways that you can become someone having a financial interest. For example, if you own a certain percentage of a corporation that owns foreign financial accounts or another kind of entity that owns foreign financial accounts. So you would have to look at the FBAR instructions to go through all of those variations. But you can have, in summary, a financial interest because of direct ownership or indirect. Signature authority is another reason that you can have to file an FBAR. And that means you can control the disposition of funds held by the financial institution. So let's look at the Pope. He is the head of the Holy See. So he's the head of the Vatican Bank. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that he has a financial interest? I don't know. He has ultimate authority over Vatican institutions. Including this Vatican Bank.
Would you say that an important question would be whether the Pope has the ability to control the disposition of funds in any of these accounts, regardless of whether there's actual signatory authority?
Yes, I think so. I don't think there necessarily has to be a paper saying I have signature authority over these accounts. I think if you, by your, discussions with the bank or your power, you can direct what the bank should do with those accounts, with the assets in those accounts, suggesting like you have such significant control, then yeah, I don't think it matters. I think you would be treated under the FBAR rules as having this signature authority that counts for purposes of filing an FBAR.
See, to
What
me,
do you think,
I think
John?
that's the biggest problem here, right? That essentially we have the Pope heading up the whole organization. And,
Mhm.
I think it's a hard argument to make that as the head of the organization, much of which is controlling a ton of money and assets, that the Pope would not have the authority to direct the disposition of money in these accounts and that.
I don't think, the Pope doesn't hold the Vatican bank accounts personally, but institutionally, I believe he oversees all of them.
Right.
So,
Doesn't that give rise to an FBAR obligation?
well, that's the $1 million question. I think it can be argued.
Does the regulation not specifically say the ability to control the disposition of the funds?
That's what it says.
Yeah.
So, one would argue or could argue the Pope has that ability.
And if so, then the Pope would be required to file an FBAR, right?
Yep.
Hmm.
So our issue is the Pope's control over the Vatican accounts deemed signature authority, like he has the ability to direct the funds? Then that would be enough to make him have to file an FBAR.
Do you think that there's a significant risk that the answer to that question might be yes?
Yeah, I think it's pretty significant. I think we've got a lot of other things going on, though. So, for example, do you think the IRS would enforce FBAR against a sitting pope? There's going to be so many diplomatic and public relation concerns, even though like a legal obligation could technically exist.
Are you
If you see
suggesting
where
that?
I'm going with this, he may have that legal technical obligation because we would argue he has this deemed control, this deemed signature authority. But I don't know if the IRS would be enforcing that or would make an issue out of it.
Are you suggesting that the United States does not believe in equal application of the law?
Ooh, John, would I suggest that?
Not on a podcast, anyway. I mean,
Yeah, that's
I
what you
agree.
guys said.
I agree with you. There's certainly politics involved, but it
Mm-hmm.
does, it does, I think bring into illumination the problem, okay, or the state, if you will, right? What it means to be an American citizen
Yes.
and how it
Yes.
adds, I think a level of caution, a level of bureaucracy. I think from the point of view of the Vatican, I think a huge level of risk in appointing a U.S. citizen as the Pope. I mean, you don't have to appoint a U.S. citizen. I mean, maybe this is a good enough reason to avoid the problem altogether, right? Or to require renunciation. We will offer this to you on the condition that you renounce your U.S. citizenship.
Mhm. I think, John, this whole question just it does a few things. First of all, it points out that, you know, the FATCA and FBAR rules, how do they apply in unique cases when you have a really high profile US citizen involved, especially then when you bring in, this idea of religion and so forth. It just goes to show you that, we've got a bit of a playful angle going on here, but wow, should the laws be enforced this way regardless of the individual's status? U.S. citizenship subjects individuals to this regime of worldwide reporting, worldwide tax, technically, regardless of your status.
Right.
Okay. So, where are we here with this? asking about the Pope, what would happen in this kind of situation? We may certainly have a technical reason for him to have to file an FBAR if he's a U.S. person. Then we raise the question of, well, would the IRS pursue that? Maybe the IRS would say, well, in this case, we don't treat it as signature authority. His broad authority isn't enough for us to treat it as signature authority over the account. Don't know.
Well, or they just choose to not impose a penalty, right? I mean, there's nothing about the enforcement of this that requires a penalty, right?
Forget the penalty, John. Do you think that the Pope would want to be revealing the extent of these assets?
No, absolutely not. And my personal view of it is that I think the problem should be avoided altogether by not even considering U.S. citizens for these types of positions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's how you avoid the problem.
Correct. And, on a more practical level, John, when you have a U.S. citizen working for a non-U.S. company that undoubtedly is going to have foreign financial accounts, they don't want that U.S. citizen to be filing an FBAR reporting the signature authority he may have over the account. So, I mean, I've heard of U.S. persons being passed over for these higher positions because of their U.S. status and the foreign company, not wanting them to be involved in any of the financial type matters that might require disclosure because of their U.S. citizenship.
Well, absolutely not. I'd put it more strongly. It's not passing them over. I think U.S. citizenship probably should be a bar. I mean, look at the problems here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
interestingly, in politics as well. I mean, a few elections ago in Canada, the conservative candidate actually was a U.S. citizen, a dual citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, can you imagine the theoretical problems of a U.S. citizen, being involved in the higher echelons of governments of foreign countries?
Well, we had that situation with Boris Johnson, didn't we?
We did. We did.
And what did he do?
Don't know. Well, ultimately he renounced, but I think he had
Correct.
the
He renounced.
for the exemption.
Yeah.
It's a gigantic problem. I mean, it's what's fascinating about this is, how it's simply the fact of citizenship, right? Nothing else. Citizenship is a sufficient condition to trigger all these problems. So we get every day, whoever, a million babies born in the United States, and every one of them, is essentially because of it. And these laws disable from a range of opportunities in the modern world, right?
Correct. Now, John, let's pivot to resident-based taxation as a model. What would happen there?
Well,
That solves some of this. Would it
it would
solve some
solve
of
the
it?
reporting requirements that come from the Internal Revenue Code. So presumably, a U.S. person would become a resident without regard to citizenship. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, residence-based taxation would not solve that per se, because that's just a different set of rules. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have this reporting obligation for life wherever you may be in the world. So I think you've still got it without, of course, this can be handled very easily through regulation because, as you know, the FBAR rules are not really a statute so much as just a, regulation that can be changed from time to time. But at least that's
Correct. So I think, in essence, I believe if you were to switch over to a residency-based taxation model, that the FBAR would become part of that entire reform, or else it's only a half-baked idea.
right. You'd hope so.
So, yeah, I think it would be, depending, how seriously the resident-based taxation issues are becoming. And I have to go back and look, but didn't Representative LaHood's elective residency-based taxation model take it into account? Foreign financial
I believe
accounts?
that it did. I
I
believe.
thought it did. So there's some awareness, is what I'm trying to say. There's some awareness of this issue. And if things get taken forward, seriously, then I believe there would be some accounting for it. But yeah, let's see if the next pope will be a U.S. citizen. I think now after our podcast, the Cardinals will be making sure when they vote to take this into account.
Well, at the very least, they should call you for a consultation on the matter. I
At
would,
least.
Virginia.
I might even waive the fee.
Uh, they have money to pay, Virginia. No need.
Maybe I'll request a few Hail Marys in
Uh,
lieu.
we've done so many podcasts on FBAR over the years. It's interesting. But, when this thing came into law in 1970, do you think anybody imagined that the effects of this would reach
No way.
today?
No way. No way.
Yeah. I mean,
The
it's
world was a different place then, John. I mean,
well, not only
you
the,
know,
the world a different place, but I think that I think that FBAR was probably an idea. The idea was kind of let's see where it goes, but I don't think that it was ever intended to operate as a fundraiser, to use against Americans abroad. I don't think that it was designed to be something to specifically limit the career opportunities of U.S. citizens.
for sure not.
Yeah, I mean the
To
problem.
cause such disharmony with married couples where one is a U.S. person and the other isn't. And there's
Well,
issues about
yeah,
joint accounts and, should we have joint accounts? And I want you to have signature authority over this if something happens to me. And, this causes real life problems for dual national couples.
yeah, AKA the FBAR marriage.
Yes, the FBAR marriage. So,
Well, so as we bring this sort of to an end today, I mean, I think we've identified this as a potential issue. What would be your advice to any U.S. citizen cardinals who are wanting to maintain the opportunity to become the Pope at some point in their lives? What would your advice be?
well, I think they would have to start off with a thorough understanding of our U.S. tax system and decide to get rid of their citizenship before they became a cardinal.
What about adding to the general courses on canon law? What about adding a U.S. module on FBAR? What do you think?
Oh, I think that would be a grand idea, John. I'd be happy to host that kind of learning
Yeah,
opportunity.
absolutely. I mean, I think that you put it that way, Virginia, and I just realized that I think that education on FBAR is absolutely essential for a globally minded person of the 21st century. Would you think?
Oh, completely. And I have mentioned on many other podcasts, it should be understanding the U.S. tax system and understanding obligations of reporting your foreign financial assets and reporting income related to your foreign holdings should be mandatory before you're allowed to get a green card or before you're allowed to become a U.S. citizen. You got to understand those rules. I don't know if you've ever looked at some of the questions they asked before you can become a U.S. citizen, but
There's not a single question on FBAR?
I've not ever heard of one.
You must be kidding me. The most
No.
important thing they don't even ask.
Well, exactly. They've got to make sure that people understand their obligations. I mean, how many times, John, have you spoken to individuals who have taken on green cards or U.S. citizenship and were absolutely clueless that they should be reporting about and being taxed by the U.S. on the income generated by those assets held overseas and reporting the existence of those assets held overseas?
Well, any conversation that you or I would have necessarily, they wouldn't know about it. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. And I think it's largely, it's the sort of what I call the siloization of legal specialties, right? So we have immigration lawyers who don't know anything about this, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's
Right.
almost, I mean,
That's
I think that taxation reporting is so much a part of what it means to be an American citizen or resident. It's so much of a part that I think that this should be front and center of all immigration law courses, actually. I mean, it's crazy that, people can go through the whole process or, deal with some immigration aspect of U.S. law and not consider this.
I agree,
But
but it's the reality. Unfortunate reality.
do you think that if people knew this, fewer of them would become citizens or want to get green cards or come to the United States for any reason?
I think they would think about it far more seriously. And, I know I've had discussions with a lot of people who live in countries where they don't feel very secure and they're looking at getting green cards. And then when the entire system is explained to them, they cross the U.S. off their list as a possible place to want to go. So I think when people understand the ramifications, then they think twice about it. Some of them decide, no, this isn't for me. Others say, yes, I understand and would like to move forward. And that's fine. But as long as they have a good understanding of what they're getting into, I believe that's the most critical thing.
Oh, it absolutely is. And just before we close, I know we hadn't talked about this, or I don't think we've talked about this. Do you have any thoughts on this Trump gold card thing?
I've not seen a keen response to it. People think it's too expensive, for one. I don't think they're viewing it as anything so great because, from my understanding, they're still going to be responsible for paying tax.
Well, not on their non-U.S. source income. That's the interesting thing.
Right.
So it's essentially it's creating a new tax category. But we'll do a podcast on that if and when it becomes a reality. Well, so this you can add this to your fine list of selections on FBAR under your blog. But speaking of your blog, where would people get more of your wisdom?
Oh, okay. Then I'm happy for people to get more of my wisdom at www.us-tax.org. O-R-G. I think everyone knows what a hyphen is. Yeah, John?
It's the horizontal little line between the two letters.
Yes, it's a little dash. It's not the underscore. So it's us-tax.org.
U.S.
Reading. We have a whole section on FBAR.
US-tax.org. US-tax.org. Yeah. Great stuff on that. All right. Well, wonderful. I appreciate you taking the time to canvass this issue today. And I think that down the road, there may be some other people who appreciate you having taken the time to canvass this issue today. So,
Hope so. Let's see, John, what's going to happen with the next Pope.
or maybe you'll get a phone call a year from now. Oh my God. I wish I'd heard this podcast a year ago.
Wouldn't that be something?
You never know.
You do never know. Exactly.
Well,
So, John, you have a great day over there in Canada, and I'll talk to you again soon.